notable by what they can become and how they change than by what they are. It's much less interesting, much less significant, actually much less important to say this is what this is, certainly true in the way of the ring motive, than all the various things they can become, all the ways they can metamorphose and transform themselves. But the Valhalla motive, even though it does undergo certain changes, is very much always the same. The one thing about the Valhalla motive which always is dynamic. By dynamic, I mean in change and movement, but which is constant. It's just, the dynamism is established right at the beginning, is the way in which it grows directly out of, wrong pedal, that the shape of the ring motive determines the shape of the Valhalla motive, and the way the Valhalla motive grows out of the ring motive. It's not a real musical, there's no musical analysis that could say this is where it comes from, but we hear it that way. And Wotan, Wagner makes us hear it that way. As a matter of fact, he not only does so because we hear the Valhalla motive for the first time as a direct outgrowth of this repetitions of the ring motive each time in its sort of softer guise, but in the passage that Simon just played for us, then after we have the first complete presentation of the Valhalla motive, as we supposedly, although we almost never do anymore, see Valhalla on stage, it's actually very important, it would seem to me, that some manifestation of Valhalla should be shown because it represents very much something that's happening in the music. The problem is I think that's a very difficult thing for stage designers to do, other than have some kind of vague-looking palace, which is kind of unsatisfactory. And for instance, in the current, that's one of the big disappointments, I think, in the current Met Ring, is that there was absolutely no representation at all of Valhalla, as far as I can tell. He doesn't know what to do with it, so he just doesn't do anything with it. But then after this, Wotan is asleep, and she's trying to wake him up. He's dreaming. And the music that he's dreaming to is not the Valhalla motive, it's the ring motive. Again, we go back to the ring motive before. Now, there's no real, it's a very early example in the Ring des Nibelungen in the work, of something which I've probably said 1,000 times and which could be repeated 1,000 times again, is that we must not think of the motives as being labels and tags and saying, why is this, is this means this and this means this? Well, if this means this, why is it here? If the Tarnhelm motive means the Tarnhelm, then why do we hear it in the scene between Waltraut and Brunhilde when they're talking about anything but the Tarnhelm? And that's because the motives take on very, very broad metaphoric and symbolic meanings. And even those are in constant change, influenced by things that are around them, influenced by events, and also influenced by our memories. Wagner assumes, and I think all composers do, that at least on a unconscious level, on a peripheral level, we remember everything we've heard. That it somehow enters into our brains and we've heard it. And so that the very fact that, let's say, two motives are heard in very close conjunction, are heard growing out of each other as the Valhalla motive grows out of the ring motive, we're supposed to remember that forever. It will always change the way we think of it. We can never think of it without that connection. That is colored forever our set of associations, our emotional response to what that motive means. So anyway, when Wotan is asleep dreaming, and then she finally does wake him up, he's dreaming back to the ring motive again. So he's really emphasizing this link. And that's sort of one very important part of Wotan's music, the Valhalla music. The other very, very important aspect of Wotan's music, one which is infinitely more dynamic, more complex, although not more ambivalent, equally ambivalent, is the spear. Actually, the first real instance of the spear motive we also hear in that little example that Simon played. The spear motive in its sort of definitive form is... It's just a downward scale with a lot of rhythmic vigor. Now, one very big difference, if you just compare these two things, this one is very majestic and sort of noble and rather complete. I mean, it's a melody, it's a set of harmonies, it has a shape, whereas this is more sort of bald. I mean, you can't really call that a melody, and you can't really call it complete. That it has no harmonic connotation whatsoever. There's no chords. You could put whatever chords, or usually no chords at all, to it. It's neutral in that respect. It has a very basic shape. It's one of these things which Wagner called, Wagner never used the word leitmotif, as probably all of you at this point know, but one term he did use was plastische Naturmotiven, or Urmotiven, plastic nature motives, or Urs in the sense of sort of basic motives, and sort of building blocks. And the Valhalla motive is a very specific manifestation of something, but the spear motive is an entirely different matter. The spear motive is one of the basic building blocks of the ring. From a musical standpoint, it's like Valhalla motive is a very, very specific molecule, which consists of very specific a group of atoms. The spear motive is an atom. And whereas our physical universe contains hundreds of 120, or they're up to a lot of elements now, many different elements, the elements in Wagner's ring are few, or perhaps fewer than 10, or perhaps even fewer than 6. But one of these is the spear motive. And it is so because Wagner purposely picks for these basic Urmotiven something which is so sort of basic and in musical vocabulary. I mean, a rhythmic scale is a very basic thing. I mean, scales, which is just basically, going either up or down in a single direction, is a very basic musical element. So it's for Wagner a very useful, a very, very practical consideration if he wants to build the ring. And we also must never forget that as a musician, Wagner had very specific goals in the ring. Not just in his own, all of the music dramas, but in the ring in particular. Goals which he sets out very completely in the essays which he wrote after the completion of Lohengrin and before the beginning of the composition of the ring. Especially, I guess, in opera and drama, but also in Communication to My Friends and in other works as well. And they're basically parallel and complementary goals. One is to write a music drama, an opera, where the music by its very character is completely dramatic. That the music is not just any old music, but it's music which is absolutely impregnated to its very essence with the drama. It's part of the drama. The other aspect is to write the very best music. And Wagner has a very clear idea of what the best music is. The best music is music which is organically linked, which grows out of a small amount of materials and gains enormously both in unity but also in meaning and in power because of all the interconnections. And for him, the model for this is absolutely clearly Beethoven. Beethoven of the great symphonies, the great string quartets, that Wagner feels that their great power derives from Beethoven's ability to create these far-flung and magnificently organized works of art based on very small amounts of these very basic materials. And like Beethoven, who typically uses things like very simple or these very, very simple, uncomplicated themes, which are almost not melodies. Wagner also uses very things like that, or basically just a chord as his basic elements. So in this case, Wagner is very, very, very definitely modeling himself on Beethoven. But however, we must never fall into the trap of separating the two parts. That the music is to be unified, is to be derived from a very small amount of basic motives, but at the same time it is to be absolutely, intrinsically, essentially dramatic in its character. So the spear motive is one of these basic elements. So in that respect, it's very different from the Valhalla motive, which they have different kinds of musical functions. The spear motive is extremely general. And let's talk, what does the spear motive mean? What does the spear mean about Wotan and about the ring? And I think it's worthwhile to stop a second and think about that. I remember early on I used to get into these very silly arguments with people whether that motive was the motive of the spear or the motive of contracts. And that, again, grows out of somebody's stupid book where they are giving titles to it. And I don't actually mind calling that the spear motive, only because I'm using the term as a symbol in itself. To what extent it actually stands for Wotan's spear as an object is immaterial to me. Wotan's spear itself as an object is in itself a metaphor, a symbol. What is it a metaphor and a symbol of? Well, I guess both the spear and Valhalla are metaphors for power, certainly, but for different ideas of power. the metaphor of the Valhalla certainly has to do with the idea of power is safety, power is permanence, power is magnificence, power is glory. It's very important to recognize, too, that the symbolism, the presence of Valhalla is constant throughout the Ring. And we hear it with a certain thrill. When, for instance, in the first act of Walküre, when Siegmund says, "I came back and never found my father again, only an empty wolf's skin," we hear not the spear motive, we hear this little shadow of Valhalla. The first time the music is telling us for sure what we've probably already suspected, that this old man who happened to be his father, he's not an old man at this point, was Wotan. And later on, in the same act, when Sieglinde tells her story about the man who wanders into the wedding and sticks the sword into the spear and looks at everybody and inspires tremendous fear in them, but looks at her with extraordinary combination of pity and tenderness, that she somehow recognizes and thrills to, we hear again. We hear, in a certain kind of way, in a certain very ironic kind of way, Valhalla seems to stand for all the noblest, the best aspirations of Wotan. Although Valhalla grows directly out of the Ring, it is completely, entirely corrupt. At the very end of the Ring, at the very, very, very end, the final peroration in the score, after Brunhilde has gone into the fire, the music is once again dominated by the Valhalla motive, repeated over and over passage which mirrors to some extent the entrance of the gods into Valhalla, and also mirrors, of course, the scene depicted by Waltraud. And it's right to the very climax, and then, of course, it is shattered by at the very, very end. Nevertheless, this image of sort of the grandeur of Wotan, the grandeur of this dream of stability, of power, as corrupt as it is. The spear, by its very nature, is a much more complex and, I think, dynamic concept. I guess more than anything else, it stands for Wotan's desire to rule the world through law, through rules. The idea of the rule of law, the rule of agreements, the rule of interconnections, the rule of promises, of contracts, as they said, if you want to call it that. Certainly the contract with the giants is a very specific one. It's an active principle. Valhalla is a dream, is an idea, is a concept in a way. The spear is an active principle. Even the image of the spear is sort of the ultimate phallic symbol. Well, the sword too, which also, I guess you could say, an active principle. One thing I thought was kind of interesting to think about is the spear is omnipresent in the Ring, and especially omnipresent in Walküre, as I'll give a very, very brief panorama of in a second. And the spear is on stage every time Wotan is. Wotan is inseparable from his spear. Even when Wotan is not on stage in Götterdämmerung, we have a lot of the spear is present, both ironically and also for instance, in the Norn scene. We only hear about the genesis of the spear in the Norn scene. Which was actually in the original, the original idea of the Ring, when it was just Siegfried's Tod. We also heard about that. It was very interesting that in Siegfried's Tod, in which Wotan doesn't appear at all, if Wagner had written his first version of the Ring, we would never have seen Wotan. There never would have been the character Wotan on stage. He who in the final Ring becomes, in a way, I guess, the main character of the Ring, would have not had any role. Still, he felt it was essential. At the very, very, very first sketch of the very, very, very beginning of the Ring, in its first version, we have the Norns talking about how Wotan made the spear. And of course, he makes the spear by drinking of the wells of wisdom, which give him the power to make these runes. He tears off a branch from the world ash tree, and after which the wells of wisdom dry up and the world ash tree starts to die. So making the spear has very sort of holy and mystical roots, but it also has very dire consequences to the world of nature. But how many times in the Ring do we actually see the spear used? And are these uses positive or negative? Anybody want to come up with some? I mean, I have them all, I think, in my head, but When do we actually see Wotan use his spear? Okay, let's be orderly here. Summoning Loga, that's one, yes. Yes, he tries, that's right. He uses the spear unsuccessfully. Oh, so we have three now. Yes?
In Rheingold, not through force.
Exactly. The first time we see the spear, let's start with Simon's here, and now do them in order. The spear is talked about already at the very beginning when he's talking with Fricka, when she first mentions that you got yourself involved in this mess, and we already hear it sort of muttering in the bass. It's not a big deal. But the first time we hear it as a big deal is when it really looks like it's going to come to a head, and Donner is going to really have it out and beat these giants over the head with his hammer, and we have in the trombones. And Wotan says, "Stop, you wild one, nothing through force, nothing through violence. Nichts durch Gewalt." And actually, the immediate response of Freya is, "Wehe, woe, Wotan betrays me," which is kind of an interesting reading of the action. But anyway, Wotan will not allow violence in that point to come out. That's the first time. He doesn't use the spear in the sense that he doesn't stab anybody with it, but the spear is a directly, and they all respect it. They do respect it. Both Donner and the giants back off when he does that. That's the first time. Is there any other time that we see the spear actually used in Rheingold? I don't think so. I don't think so. No, it's just there.
Dramatically, I've seen lots of rings where he cuts off Albert's finger to get the ring.
Yeah, that would be, that to me is a big, egregious mistake of directors. And it's based, they really want to gild the lily. They want to and Wagner already makes it musically very clear at that moment. That's something very good. I'm glad you brought that moment up, because that introduces something that Wagner becomes part of the vocabulary of the spear music, which is, the spear has always gone down. I might as well say it. It's always gone down. But that, when Wotan is going to wrestle for him, it goes back and forth, and it comes up. There's a kind of outrage. And it is an outrage. It is a misuse of Wotan's power. But actually, it is not really the power of the spear. Wotan is not cutting off his finger as with a spear as a... he's not using the power of the spear to cut off his finger or cut off the ring. On the contrary, he's if anything, the spear is being violated. The spirit of the spear is being very much violated. And this turmoil within the idea of Wotan's rule by law is illustrated by its coming back up on itself. It goes down usually, and it goes up on itself. But he's not really using the spear there. On the contrary, he uses the spear the first time we see it as a prophylactic, as a means to avoid of contact. The second time we see Wotan use his spear, now we hear the spear motive in a very interesting place. We hear a very complete bare. When Wotan promises, he makes his vow to Fricka that he will kill Sigmund. That he will tell Brunhilde specifically. He's tried to squirrel out of it every possible way. First he says, well, I won't protect him. And she says, yes, but your daughter will. She says, well, she can choose freely. She says, no, she can't. She's your will. You have to specifically tell her. And then finally, she says, do I have the vow from Wotan? This is right before the passage, the famous Alex Ross passage, the passage that we just heard in Simon's. Wotan says, yes, take the oath, nimm den Eid. And we hear the very naked spear motive by itself. But I think that's a reference rather than an actual using the spear. But he will be using the spear in that act. The next time I think that we actually see the spear being used, first time the spear is used prophylactically. The second time is he destroys the sword with the spear. That's not usually true in productions, but it's explicitly true in the score. That Brunhilde is protecting Sigmund and going to guarantee his victory in battle. Let's face it, Hunting doesn't stand a chance against Sigmund anyway. Actually, Brunhilde doesn't even really need to be there if we're going to be literal. Come on, Besides, this sword was made for this. This is Wotan's sword. This is not just any old sword. And this is, as a matter of fact, it's a very important part. We're not talking about the sword today, but the spear. But the sword, after all, is the repository of Wotan's great idea. so much so. And yet Wotan's great idea is shattered because it is an incomplete, flawed idea. Just as when it is reforged by Siegfried as an act of freedom, it will turn around and shatter the spear. So it's kind of an interesting reversal there, which makes even more sense if thinking of the sword as Wotan's, as the repository, as the symbol, as the metaphor of Wotan's great idea, which has to do intrinsically with freedom, with the idea of free will and freedom. Yeah? That somewhat is skewered. That somewhat is actually skewered. Yes, metaphoric. That's probably true. And as a matter of fact, Wotan's spear, it's used to something. It's a weapon, but it's obviously a very magic weapon, since he doesn't. I don't know that Wotan takes the sword and smashes it with the spear this way, or whether he just holds it out. What he says is, he says to Brunhilde, "Zurück von dem Speer," get away from the spear. And then he says, and pieces the sword, and Stücken das Schwert, and the sword falls to pieces. Now, I've always assumed it does so just through the power of the spear and the relationship between Wotan and the sword as it is at this point. But maybe he actually whacks it, in which case that would be being used as a weapon. In any case, that's very clearly a place where the spear is being used. And then at the end of the next act, the end of Act 3 of Walküre, we have the spear being used again, if you want, not in the usual spear manner, but in a more metaphoric or symbolic manner, but a very, very, very important way in which the spear is very concretely used. And that's, as I guess you said, when he conjures up Loga. We hear a very complete form of the spear motive, just all again by itself in the trombones. And he calls what he actually in the score and in most productions he whacks the spear 3 times on the ground, and then Loga springs up in the form of the magic fire. This, of course, is a very creative and action. We know that Wotan has magically tamed Wotan, Loga, who was just fire, with the spear, because actually Loga himself tells us that, but mostly the Norns tell us that later. And then he turns him back, and Loga says at the end he's very tired of this business, and maybe he would like to just turn himself back into fire. Well, Wotan does it at the end of Walküre. It's very important for us to remember, and I guess it's important for stage directors to make us remember, is that fire that's conjured up at the end of Walküre is not just a fire. It's the god Loga. I mean, it's a transformation of Loga and everything that he represents. So that's clearly a direct action of the spear. Then the next time we actually see the spear being used, although ineffectively, is against Siegfried. And this time where Siegfried destroys the spear. So that's it. Now, there is one other time in which the spear is not being used directly, but it is being used indirectly, and that's at the immolation scene. The next to the last part of the immolation scene, when it starts, very much music, because it comes right out of the fire afterwards, that harkens back to when Wotan is calling Loga. And this is, of course, Brunhilde's talking, and she's telling the ravens to fly home, and go tell Loga to go back to Valhalla, and the time has come for him to burn it up. And we know that the spear will be used again, although it's just the haft of the spear, I guess the point of the spear, because the Norns tell us that Wotan will take at this time the point of the spear and stab Loga in his breast, and will cause Loga to flame up and burn down Valhalla. So this is, I think, a clear allusion to that. This is all very metaphoric and symbolic, nevertheless. So I guess really my point is that we see the spear used very seldom in the ring, and when it's used as usually quite obviously positive, really. I mean, the one time it's not positive is when it destroys Siegmund. The end of Act 2 of Walküre is one horrible use of the spear, and in combination with the sword motive in the minor, and of course then when Siegfried will break the spear with his sword, the sword motive is in the major. The spear is itself, the motive is neither major nor minor. That's one of the things that makes it such a terrific building block, is it has, except for the scale function and the slight rhythmic kind of energy it has really no characteristics at all. Harmonically, it can fit any kind of harmonic language just because it's just a scale. I can do a scale. It still has that scale pattern. That's quite a different motive, as you obviously recognize. But I could also do, and that colors it with that chord. It sounds like, reminds me of the ring. In other words, it can remind us, it can be colored by almost everything else. So it's a wonderful building block for Wagner's purposes, because we can hear it and say and have some recognizable feature that reminds us, oh, this is Wotan's will being involved, and yet it can be colored by all the music around it because it is such a basic building block. Okay, so now let's talk about Act 1. Yes, please.
It sounds so negative. It sounds so like doom.
Because you mean the. I don't think it should sound negative. I think what it sounds is authoritarian. That it does sound. It sounds strong and unbending and unwielding. In its basic definitive form, there's something completely. But I don't think it should sound negative. I mean, this should sound negative. Or those kinds of things have different kinds of negative feelings. One is sinister, and this other one is painful. And I think that's.
Sounds like pending doom to me.
I can't help that. No, but it has. But it has doom. It has. I can see the doom in that it seems implacable.
Yeah.
But the point is that that's because in its definitive form it does. But it's such a basic element. We'll see that a lot of the ways we're going to hear it in Walküre, it has quite a different sort of feeling.
I think it's kind of like it's saying also stay tuned, more to come.
Well, that's because of its neutrality. That's right. And there's another reason too. By the way, that's actually your ears telling you something that you probably wouldn't be able to analyze intellectually, which is that it's harmonic neutrality. It doesn't have any harmonic meaning. It doesn't. See, if I hear. It's just got to be this. It doesn't have to be that because you guys have studied harmony and you know that I just played a series of secondary dominant chords or Neapolitan sixths or something like that. You don't need to know that. Those are just names for things that describe a thing, that there is a consequentiality of it. Because the spear motive has no harmonic in itself, consequentiality. It doesn't define any kind of harmonic situation at all. We're waiting for it to declare itself. It needs for it to declare itself. I mean, if I just play, that's not a complete sentence musically. Something's got to come after that. In a completely different. Yes, however, in very, very significant different way. The Tristan chord ends on a sense of expectation. We know what it wants to do, it just doesn't do it. The Tristan chord, you should think of it not as a single chord, but as a whole phrase. There's an extraordinary amount of harmonic tension in that phrase. We definitely want it. It needs to go. It needs to make some kind of modulation. It needs to do something. See, it needs to resolve. It just doesn't. He never once does that. Not once. Never. In all of Tristan does he does. But Tristan is all about these preparations that don't get satisfied. And it's, of course, it's a very powerful metaphor for the dramatic situation as well. Whereas the spear motive is doesn't set up any we want something to happen because we expect it to in music, but it doesn't set up any kind of particular. It's completely neutral in its situation.
Like saying stay tuned.
Yeah. No. That's. And I think that's.
Can I tell one more point on that? The last thing about Act 1, we never resolved funding, and Wotan makes reference to the spear when he tells Hundy, now go and slay the.
No, we hear the spear. We hear the whole spear motive, and actually we.
He tells her that Wotan's spear avenged was shanked.
That's right.
And then he kills him.
That's right. Okay, I wasn't going to go into that, but I will. Okay, can you mind if I do that in order? I'll get to that. I'll get to that very shortly. Let's talk about Act 1, and I wasn't going to go into Hundy's music, but I will. Wotan's spear, we never see Wotan in Act 1, right? Act 1 of Walküre, Wotan makes no appearances. Wotan is talked about, although they don't know it's Wotan, or we don't think they know it's Wotan. And by both Siegmund, when he talks about his father, and Sieglinde, when she talks about the mysterious guest who puts the sword in the tree during her wedding ceremony. And in both of those cases, the Valhalla motive is always used to talk about it. So there's no clear reference to the spear motive or the spear or Wotan's authority anywhere in Act 1. And yet Act 1 of Die Walküre is absolutely saturated with music which is related to the spear motive. There is, by the way, a completely naked and unadorned appearance of the spear motive in Act 1. But it's so subtle that probably very few people hear it. Let me play it for you. Oh, here it is. Okay. Hunding says how he resembles the woman. They have the same worm of conceit, a worm of deceit gleaming out of his eyes as it does of hers. It's on this. This little bass clarinet solo. That's almost an exact quotation rhythmically to the very first time we hear it when Fricka is saying, "You got yourself caught up in this stupid contract with the giants, and you promised Freya." So it's definitely there. Why it's there and what it means that it's there, I'm going to get to in just one second. So what is the very first music we hear in Walküre? We hear this big storm on stage, the storm that is kind of a metaphor for Siegmund's situation. I mean, which is pretty stormy to say the least. It's the scale coming up and down and up and down and up, coming up very fast and then back down. Well, if we buy into the idea that scales, the musical scales, are a sort of a symbol of this basic atomic structure idea in the ring, one of the building block of the ring that's involved with the idea of Wotan's spear as a metaphor of this, then to someone in my business, let's say, to a musician, any musician who hears the beginning of Rheingold, beginning of Walküre, who knows the music of Rheingold, will immediately make a connection to Wotan's spear. After all, and Wagner was a musician. This beginning is Wotan's spear in torment, in agitation. I'm not saying it's the spear motive. It's a description of a storm, but it's a description of storm using this building block over and over and over and over again. And after about 1,000 repeats at the end, it ends, and the character walks on stage, and that's Siegmund's first appearance, right? That's also a scale. Also scale with that little rhythm in it. And it kind of also curves up at the beginning. And I think Wagner, as a musician, is telling us in an incredibly small amount of time everything we really need to know about Siegmund and his situation. That the storm in which he lives is his own doing, is the creation of his own will, and that Siegmund now, you were talking about the lack of harmonic connotation. There is no harmonic connotation in this, in its naked form. But this, if I play the whole passage, I think you'll hear it even better. When Siegmund first comes on stage. Woeful stuff. This is painful. We have all that, which we know from Rheingold always has to do with woe and pain and struggle. And besides, that marks this diminished chord, this chord which we associate really mostly with the ring, the kind of harmony that is, if nothing. But certainly not good stuff. I won't go so far as to say that's colored by the ring. You could, and people do. But nevertheless, this is a version of the spear motive, which is very, very unambiguous in terms of its harmonic context. It is emotional context, and it's contorted and suffering and full of woe and full of stress. Very shortly after, though, practically the next page, when she runs to get him water in that one wonderful moment, the same scale. Scales. All these scales now have this very radiant and melodic quality. So again, it's and I just want to repeat that I'm not saying this is the spear motive, but the spear is present through its musical symbolism. Yes. But here it's present in a very much more obviously very positive light. If you start looking, I mean, I almost just turn the page at random. He's talking. She says he mentions that he's wounded, and she says, "Let me see your wounds." And he says, "Nothing. The wounds are nothing." These downward scales in this pointed rhythm. Well, that is the spear motive. I mean, of course, it's not the spear motive. It's not. But all of this, Wagner is making it, is reinforcing over and over and over again in our minds this presence of the Wotan's will as being that which has set up the whole theater of actions here. That these are people who want to be free, who will act to become free, but are nevertheless caught up in a theater entirely not of their own making, and a situations entirely not of their own making, and a situation which is entirely a projection of Wotan's will. Wotan is omnipresent in this scene, and in this entire act, and as really kind of the tragic guarantor. It is guaranteed not to work out well, precisely, unfortunately, because of this presence. Although yes, and he hadn't read Schopenhauer yet when he wrote this act, but still, that doesn't matter. There's just so many places I could play in this act that have this, but I want to just, because of the question, I'm going to do Hunding. What time am I supposed to stop? Okay, oh good, no, that's the time. I just also wanted to point out then that one of the techniques that Wagner uses in The Ring, all through The Ring, is that when he is using the motivic material in a highly symbolic or highly metaphoric way, a way that's very far away from its initial association, either musical association or dramatic association, he always puts implants someplace in the proceedings the kind of clear-cut, definitive version. So he's like calling our attention. This is very, very much like what Renaissance painters do. For instance, when they use abstract ideas that have very strong associations. A good example of this would be almost any painting of Raphael's, that practically any religious painting of Raphael, but I'm thinking especially about scenes of Madonna and Child. And this would be especially true of scenes of Madonna and Child and John the Baptist, where he is putting all these artificially constructed triangles in the construction of the three heads, in the construction of the way the clothes are setting, in the construction of people's hands, in the architectural outline. All of these triangles, which of course are clear references to the Trinity and this kind of completion. The use of colors, for instance, the fact that blue stands for the Spirit and red stands for the Passion, and he'll put them in these triangular patterns, and they'll appear in very sort of unnatural ways, in a way, to emphasize these kind of symbolic things. This is kind of the thing that Wagner is doing in a music dramatic setting here. But Wagner wants to help us, and he wants to make sure that we pay our attention. And so all of these very symbolic and altered manifestations, let's call them rather than occurrences, of spear music in Act 1, need to have focus called to them. It needs to remind us, tell the listener, hey, this is what it really sounds like. See, what you're hearing is actually all versions of the spear motive. So this place where Hunding says they look just like each other, and we hear the bass clarinet, we expect it to go like it's done 40 times already in this short act so far. But instead it goes all the way down, so that it surprises us, but also it's supposed to call our attention. I guess part of the problem is that this language of music and music metaphor and music structure is highly sophisticated, I guess you could say, and Wagner's or Beethoven's or anybody else's attempts to do these things pass probably unobserved by the great majority of listeners. But they won't be unobserved by you from now on. Going on to Hunding. Hunding's music, of course, is that's clearly Hunding has his own sonority, the Wagner tubas, etc. But there's another piece of music which, at least in this act, we very much associate with Hunding, which is when he right away says, my house is holy, sacred. May you hold it sacred. In other words, he's setting up this relationship between him as the host and Siegmund as the guest. That he will find safety and security under his roof, and later on for one night, and then I'm going to kill you without weapons. It's kind of a brutal view. He says, on the one hand, you are safe. The rules of hospitality guarantee that you can sleep here safely tonight, safe from shelter and all that. And tomorrow I'm going to kill you weaponless. I'm going to come and run you through with my spear, and you don't have a weapon. Ha ha. I mean, that's exactly what he's saying. I mean, that's just precisely what he's saying. But these rules, and there's a very clear cut. There's two parts to this. Now that we may think we're not going to hear any more in the Ring, but we do. We hear it in both Siegfried and Götterdämmerung in different forms. And I don't want to go into what that is for now. But the second part of this is a very straightforward scale cadential figure. There's no reason in the world for us to connect that with Wotan's spear at this point. However, when Wotan kills Hunding, after he's killed Siegmund, or after he's allowed Hunding to kill Siegmund, he says, "Go hence, slave, kneel before Fricka," and then the orchestra takes it up. And then he says, "Go, go," and he drops dead. In other words, this he just attaches it right to it, right?
With the instruction to tell her that the spear has carried out with
Yes. Tell her that Wotan's spear avenged what brought her. It has. Yeah. The spear motif is there because he says that. But what I'm talking about, what is the spear motif reveals about what the music from Hunding before. Have you understood what I'm saying or not? Yeah, that Hunding has this music. That's just music. We hear that music. We associate it with Hunding. We're going to associate it with other things later in the Ring, but here we associate it with Hunding. And Wagner at this moment, by going, is revealing that in that motive there is the spear. That in a funny kind of way, you could say that all along Hunding is also an element of Wotan's spear. We don't know it, Hunding doesn't know it, the music doesn't know it, but it knows it here. And don't forget, the thing about the music in the Ring is everything is part of our memory bank. And that goes forwards and backwards. Wagner is very explicit about that when he writes about the music in the Ring. That it's not only that we're supposed to remember everything, we're supposed to have sort of the sense of intuition, Ahnung he calls it, of everything that's going to happen later. I mean, for instance, when Wotan has this great idea, it's associated with the sword. We haven't seen the sword yet. It's just going to be there. The music sounds pregnant with something, but we don't know what it's pregnant with. And there's lots of cases like this. I mean, actually, Wagner almost makes a point that every single major musical idea in the Ring is presented before in the music in some hidden way. It actually is apparent. And that's because Wagner is really intent, almost obsessively intent, sometimes almost silly intent, on making this idea that there is a sense of expectation for something which is to happen. But there's another much more practical reason. That means that when we hear it for the first time, our ears, on some level, however deep, however subliminal, say, I've heard this before. This means something. This has a past. This has something. So all the major, that would be an interesting topic in itself, that almost all the major material in the ring appears in some subliminal form before it actually comes in some definitive form where we actually make some association with it.
You did an excellent illustration of that, but let me ask this question. You said that hunting does say, on one end, a good knife and I can automatic video without a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And hunting goes all the time, and that sword is sticking in that tree in the middle of his living room.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that presumes, as a reasonable person would, that he himself has tried to pull that sword out.
Well, damn straight. He would have been the first one to try to pull it out. Hell, come on.
So he's not worried about that.
No. I think it would never have occurred to Hunding that Siegmund would, if no one else has been able to pull that well, put it this way. If Hunding has thought that Siegmund might be the guy who will pull that sword out of the tree, then he's a wiser man than I think he is. Nobody's been able to do it. He hasn't been able to do it. I think he has a pretty high opinion of himself. He certainly sounds like he does. And he hasn't been able to do it. If he hasn't been able to do it, then why think that this guy from a horrible, cursed, race who is outlaw, criminal, lowlife, runs into my house, probably been trying to seduce my wife, looks all too much like her, that he's going to actually be the one who can pull that sword out of a tree. I doubt it.
Well, the logical follow-up would be to that line, though, is that, and you can kill me, you can defend yourself with that sword, but you're never going to get it out of the tree. But he doesn't say anything.
Yeah. Of course, there's a funny and kind of a contradictory aspect. Siegmund is not supposed to have even noticed the sword in the tree. The first time Siegfried, the sword in the tree is hidden. And Sieglinde tries desperately to make him aware of it, and whether or not he actually has seen it when he's talking in the little interlude between her return after she's put Hunding to sleep, he talks, of course, that great moment when he says "Velza, Velza, Father, Father," and the very first thing he says after she goes away is, this music that accompanies Wotan's. When Wotan originally has the great idea, it starts. And that's exactly what Siegmund sings before, when he says, a sword my father promised me in the moment of my greatest need. And then, of course, whether he actually sees it then or whether he's just projecting the dream of it, I don't know. But in most productions, he sees it. I mean, it gleams forth or something. And this one, very magically. There's a moment where it gleams forth extremely magically at one time. And in most productions, he's seen it. But the idea is that the sword is hidden to some extent. But I mean that varies from production to production. There are productions where the sword is just like they hang their clothes on it. Well, quite literally. Yeah, quite literally, right. I mean, it is a rather strange conceit. Frankly, not that many living rooms I've been in have ash trees growing in the middle of them either. No, Hunding saw it because her description is pretty clear. They're having their wedding party, everybody's in there, and this guy walks in the room and thrusts the sword into the tree and walks out. And she says that everybody tried to get it out, and I assume that Hunding was the very first. People came from all over the world to try to pull this thing out, and nobody could do it. And it's still, and whether I don't know whether Hunding. I'm not privy to that, but it never occurred to me to wonder too much whether. I think that Hunding just thinks that he's found this awful outlaw and he's going to get his comeuppance. But Hunding is a man of the law, and law is associated to some extent with Wotan's spear. Now that's a very Wotan's spear is not always as bleak kind of law as that, but it inevitably seems to become that way. So.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, carrying this on. Why was there some law or something in the culture that Sigmund violated when he came into the house?
No. No, he wants to kill him because he's the enemy. He went to kill him because he killed his kinsman. Yeah, that's nothing to do with it. On the contrary, the law is the only reason he doesn't kill him right away. The only reason he doesn't run him through as soon as Sigmund says who he is because has the law. By the law he's his guest and he has one free night stay. Now the question is why Sigmund doesn't run away. Well, why doesn't Sigmund run away? He wants Sieglinde. Got that one in one. Just one other. There's a lot of other places I could talk about in Act 1, but one other one which I think is particularly felicitous. As I said at the beginning, this storm is a storm in a way of Wotan's spear as it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. Well, we do hear that in a funny kind of way. Again, although the element of Wotan's spear has almost disappeared, and we hear it at the beginning of the Wintersturme. That's... Now he's just sort of transformed it. Sure, it is a man running through the forest. And we're all supposed to hear it. Every one of us should hear it. It is, but it's also raindrops. It's lots of things. And this is the wind, the rain, and the wind, and the storm, and everything. But sure, a man running through the forest. That absolutely, sure. One of the great things about music in particular, but drama in general, but music definitely in particular, is it doesn't have to mean one thing. It can mean a lot of things. What it tells us is that the man running through the forest in this terrible storm with this wind and rain and then the lightning and thunder that we're going to hear is a man who was caught up in a trap made by Wotan's spear. We can say that. How's that? Okay, let's move on to Act 2. Now, Act 2, of course, the spear is much more immediately apparent. Actually, we hear it when Wotan, in very kind of a short form, when Wotan is first heard after this magnificent prelude, and he's in a very good mood, and he's telling Brunhilde to get ready for battle because she's going to, Siegmund is going to kill Hunding. All these downward scales, repeated over and over again. It doesn't have the rhythmic version, but it's in that same world. It's something that reminds us of it. But where Wotan's spear really comes to the fore in this act is later. I mean, there's lots of different reminiscences of it from Rheingold, for instance, when in the scene with Fricka, he's talking about the treaty with the giants. We, of course, hear that's another extension of Wotan's spear, by the way, that it just adds. Bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 bum. It's based on that downward scale, but it's just introduced each time by an arpeggio that takes it a little bit higher. But when, I'm not going to say when because that would give away one of my questions for tomorrow, but at a certain point in the scene, a new and very important motive in the ring. So much important motive in the ring that when I hear this reminds me more than any other music of Wotan and Wotan's problems. It's usually called the motive of Wotan's frustrated will. If Wotan's will is after all, symbolically represented by his spear. This motive. And I mean, we hear this motive literally probably hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times in the course of the ring and in the course of this act. I mean. It's also a scale, but it's a scale that's done funny things. It starts with that kind of obsessive and rather unpleasant little turn, and then it turns on itself. It's going down, but every time it sort of kind of comes back on itself and sort of twists and turns. And it's actually a very vivid and very almost pictorial depiction of Wotan's will being frustrated or Wotan being in trouble, Wotan being tormented. It's also a very useful kind of piece of music because it's something that very easily builds on itself. Well, even here we'll hear it. Then he'll do it much more elaborately later. It's something that he can engender pages and pages of music out of, and sort of builds and builds on itself. It's not. Whereas the sword by itself is very difficult because it's sort of just static in a way. It makes a statement. This is something which can can derive huge amounts of music on. To make absolutely certain that we, the listener, hear that this motive is an outgrowth of the spear motive, Wagner joins them. This is something that he does over and over and over in the ring. He wants to help the listener. Wagner is a good artist. Good artists, whether they be concert pianists, composers, dramatists, painters, or architects, want to help their listeners. They want them to understand. They want them to understand. They don't want to obfuscate. They sometimes need to make it complicated for various reasons, but they do want them to understand. And he wants us to hear this connection. And he makes it very clear here. At the crucial, crucial moment, Fricka says, do you make the vow? And he says, take the vow. That's the place where we hear the Alex Ross thing right there. The Alex Ross place. So in other words, he combines the two. That should be enough for us always to make. This is a connection which isn't hard to hear anyway. But Wagner is making absolutely crystal clear that we hear forever this connection. Very shortly after this, let me just play a little sequence. This is the very beginning of the scene of Wotan's monologue. It hasn't started talking yet to her. Here, it starts with that turn again. Instead of going down. Because that's Alberic's curse. It's one of these great passages where lots and lots of material are being piled up. But the first part, it's coming. Wotan is in revolt. I mean, it's not just Wotan's will frustrated, but he is revolting against the situation. This seems it's going in. Anytime we hear this thing going up, there's this kind of distortion. Its natural form is to go down. It's being pushed up. And again, it's one of these places that we hear. It's the conjunction of things is so fast that we cannot help but hear it. Here's another new motif that occurs during Wotan's monologue. We've been hearing over and over again. He's been talking about the contract with the dragon, with the giants, and how he said himself, "These are the fetters that hold me. I, who by bargains am lord, to my bargains, to my contracts, I am now forever a slave." He says. So this is the music we hear. We hear. New motive. It goes on and on and on. And of course, this just combines things that we've already heard before. This is now combined with, which is of course this arpeggio. Anybody want to identify that just by itself? Yeah, it would usually be called Erda. I think it's kind of a little bit. Yeah, it's much broader than that. But since he's just been talking about Erda, he's gone down to Erda and learned all this new stuff. We've just heard it, but it's the minor form of this sort of the nature motive, the basic thing, and he's attaching it to this to engender a whole new kind of body of motivic material. It's kind of ridiculous at this point when he starts putting things together to find a new name each time for it. But still, and this will become also very, very, very important. For instance, what always immediately comes to mind when I think of this motive is the prelude to Act 3 of Siegfried, when he first comes back to the ring after his 11-year hiatus. That Maybe hear it very broad. It's not on this piano, but I used to love to play that prelude. Anyway, so it becomes a very major player in the ring. But just to point out, he wants us to hear again this connection with the spear motive, that it comes right out the very first time. And don't forget, over and over again, he will do it in a form where we really hear that spear motive over and over again. For instance, when he's really angry at Brunhilde at the end, and he's saying, you know, damn it, you're going to do what I want, we hear. Over and over again, attached to it, just this very violent, truncated forms of the spear in a very clear form. So it's extremely present. Okay, let's move to the Todesverkündigungsszene. The Todesverkündigungsszene, the Enunciation of Death scene, is this crucial scene when two people make big choices. Siegmund makes the choice that he's not going to go to Valhalla, that he will not abandon Sieglinde, that Sieglinde and his love for her means more to him than any promise of sort of this sterile delights of eternity in Valhalla. But perhaps even more importantly, or more importantly for the future of the ring, because Siegmund is about to die anyway, is Brunhilde makes a big choice, which is that her authority, the authority of her father, or the authority of law that her father has determined, is not as important as this love and compassion that has been awakened in her in Siegmund action. And as I played yesterday, and I'm going to play it again now, the really crucial part of the scene starts when they're really wrestling with it. After she's announced his things and he's finally said, no, I won't go. When they start wrestling with it, we hear it. I'm emphasizing a lot. You hear all those scales keep coming up, all this, and then being. That, of course, is the love motive. Let's do Mr. Lenz in a very sort of minor form, right? And then down, and all these little interruptions, these scales coming up in sort of as if in protest. There's a lot of dynamic conflict going on here, very vividly expressed metaphorically in the music. The whole scene, actually. So, if you want a real analysis of what's going on in this scene, you should read my dissertation. It's a Juilliard. Anyway, let's go then to Act 3 very quickly. And in Act 3, of course, we have this. We talked about it last night, but I'm going to play it again now, more in the context of the spear. Whoops. The spear, as we hear it or music of the spear, as we hear it in the first part of Act 3, is all pretty ghastly stuff, because Wotan is now is angry. He's probably mostly angry because he's so violently ashamed of himself and violently bitter and despairing and all these things, and anger is the one outlet that he can kind of permit himself. And over again in his attacks on Brunhilde, when he's basically saying that you betrayed me, you everything, I was everything to you, and you threw it all away, and this and that. We always hear it to this, to very bitter forms of that motive. Let's see if I can find a particularly definitive one. But anyway, over and over again, this brassy, very loud, very ugly, very harsh and kind of unrelenting. Wotan is trying very hard, I think, to be harsh and unrelenting here. And after the other Valkyrie